This presentation looks at economic growth and takes from what we've talked about thus far, really in terms of GDP. And as I've mentioned, these models that we're going to develop that help us understand principally the existing level of GDP in the US economy, which we call the equilibrium level of GDP, that's really given us this one snapshot in time. What is GDP right now? What is GDP in 2010 or in 2011? And that's important. But what's also very important to us is to understand how our measure of economic output, real GDP, changes over time. And so this is what we're going to look at here. And we refer to this as economic growth. And there are different ways we can measure economic growth, but essentially what we're trying to do is just look at the trend in real GDP or real GDP per capita over time. So when we're talking about economic growth, we're looking at trends over time and how is the nation's economy developing as time moves forwards, and how does that correspond with growth rates in other countries. So it's important that we understand what economic growth is and how it's measured, but then really what it means. So typically we define economic growth in one of two ways. One is simply the increase in real GDP over time, so however many years we're looking at. Often we look from year to year to year. Or we can look at an increase in real GDP per capita, again, over some period of time. So for the first definition, looking at real GDP over time, we need data for at least 2 points in time. And so if we know real GDP in the United States was approximately $15 billion in 2011 and rose somewhat to 15.5 approximately billion dollars in 2012, then we can use those two real GDP figures to calculate the US economic growth rate for that year, for 2012, between 2011 and 2012. And all we would need to do is then take a percent change between those two GDP figures. So we're comfortable with a percent change. To calculate a percent change, you just take the absolute change. So GDP here, this is 2012, $15.5 billion, minus here what it was in 2011, 15 billion. And then that's the change over the year period, and divide that by the starting value, i.e. GDP back in 2011. And then that would give you a decimal or a fraction, and you multiply that by 100 to put it into a percentage. So if we do this calculation here, we'd get an answer of 2.8%. So that is telling us that real GDP between 2011 and 2012 rose by 2.8%. We would expect to see some positive growth rate, but again, not always. Typically, we would expect to see year-on-year real GDP this year being higher than last year, so a positive growth rate. But as we discussed the Great Recession, in 2009, for example, the US economic growth was negative 2.4%, so real GDP fell in 2009 relative to 2008. So again, that's depicts a recession with falling GDP. Again, technically, that has to be 6 months or more. The second definition looks at real GDP per capita. So what this does, anytime you look at something, a variable in per capita terms, it's taking into consideration the population. So real GDP per capita, or sometimes just called per capita output, is the amount of real GDP per person in the United States. So we can track how the amount of GDP per capita changes over time. So to put it in per capita terms, as you can see here at the bottom, we just take real GDP, the absolute value, and divide it by the current population, the population that existed at that point in time. So real GDP per capita is real GDP in that year divided by that year's population. So again, going back to 2011, 2012 data, if you want to look at changes in real GDP per capita over that 1 year period, we need to apply the population. So if we know in 2011 the population was 311.6 million, then we would divide that year's real GDP, that $15 billion, by 311.6 million population. That gives us real GDP per capita in that year of $48,307. In 2012, a year later, again you do the same calculation using 2012 data, and we get GDP per capita in 2012 of $49,283. So an increase. Again, what we need to know is what is that increase as a percent change. So again, here we're making a calculation. Just take the change. So 2012 per capita GDP minus 2011 per capita GDP divided by, again, your starting point, 2011 per capita GDP, and times it by 100 to put it into percent terms. If you do that, you'll get a growth rate of real GDP per capita in 2012 of 2%. Again, like you expect to see an increase in real GDP over time, you'd expect to see an increase in per capita GDP over time too. But again, 2009, a recession year, we saw real GDP per capita falling, decreasing by 3.3% in that recession year. So thinking about economic growth, again, that's technically how we calculate it. Thinking about it as a widely held economic goal. It's something that policymakers will really look for in trying to see economic growth over time. So this expansion of total output relative to the population. So what does that mean? So we see growth rates in per capita GDP. Well, it's resulting in higher real wages and income. Therefore, it's really giving us this idea of standards of living. When we see real GDP per capita rising over time, we're seeing an increase or improvement in the standard of living. So an economy that experiences economic growth is therefore better able to meet people's wants and resolve any socio-economic problems. So in many nations, advanced nations like the United States, again, we expect to see this increase in living standards. You can perhaps think about, growing up in your household compared to perhaps when your parents grew up back in their day, and think about your standard of living compared to theirs, and how many TVs you perhaps had compared to how many they have, or how many cars you had compared to how many they have, how many vacations you took compared to how many they took when they were a similar age to you. And again, this is capturing this idea of the standard of living. In the US, we expect to see standards of living increasing over time. And again, we capture that by tracking per capita GDP over time. So, what is the goal? We expect to see growth in standards of living, growth in per capita real GDP over time. Well, typically, so a rough rule of thumb is that one would expect the economy to grow at roughly 2-3% a year. So we'd expect to see per capita GDP 2 to 3% higher this year than last year, and 2 to 3% higher next year than this year. So tracking real GDP over time, or per capita real GDP over time, is very important. And so why do we spend so much time and attention to looking at these growth rates, which are quite small? We're talking about 1, 2, 3%. Well, it's because the difference between a growth rate of 1 or 2 or 3% could actually be highly significant. So for the US, with a current nominal GDP of about $16 trillion, if we think about growing at, say, a 3% rate or a 4% rate, what's the difference? Again, it's just 1%. Well, the difference of 1%, though, when your base is $16.2 trillion, is $162 billion. So the difference between the US growing at 3% and 4% is worth tens and tens of billions of dollars of economic output each year. So these small changes in growth rates have large effects in terms of economic development. For a poor country, this could mean the difference between starvation and simply being hungry. A very small difference in growth rate can have a large effect. So when we look at economic growth, either changes in real GDP or real GDP per capita over some time period, typically a year, we think of this growth as a goal. So we have this arithmetic of growth, kind of a rule. It's called the rule of 70. And the rule of 70 tells us, based on an annual percentage rate of growth, the approximate number of years required to double real GDP. So if an economy grows at X% each year, how long would it take that economy to double its real GDP value? So what you do here, it's called the rule of 70, because you take 70 and you divide into that this annual percentage rate of growth. And again, when you do that, it gives you an approximation of how many years it will take for the economy to double its real GDP. So if we think an economy is going to grow at 3% annual rate each year, dividing 3 into 70 is roughly 23. That's telling us that a 3% annual rate of growth would double real GDP in an economy in about 23 years. If we look at a much larger growth rate, a growth rate that we'd rarely see sustained over time, 8%, if it were, then an 8% annual rate of growth would double real GDP in only 9 years. So again, these relatively small changes in growth rate have big effects. So when you look at nations across the world and compare different nations and how they developed over time, a good comparison would be to look at the US and the UK. So back in the 1800s, for example, the UK was the biggest power in the world, and the US was still a very small juvenile nation at that point. Fast forward 100 years later, now the US is the preeminent economic power, has the largest economy in the world, seriously dwarfing that of the United Kingdom. And over that 100-year or so time period, the difference, though, in growth rate was very small, only about 0.5%. Over that 100 years, the US grew at about 2.3% in terms of per capita GDP, while the UK grew at 1.8%, so only a 0.5% difference. But you take that 0.5% difference and you compound it over 100 years, it makes a significant difference in terms of economic output. So if we just think about the US and look at how GDP and per capita GDP have changed over time, we go back to the midpoint of the last century, so go back to 1950 and compare that to 2012 data, then real GDP in the US has increased more than 6 times over that 60-year period, growing at about a 3.1% rate per year. In terms of real GDP per capita over this 60-year period has increased by more than 3-fold. So these are large increases in GDP and GDP per capita. And the real GDP per capita growth rate over that 60 years was roughly about 2%. So, in thinking about economic growth, we pay a lot of attention to changes in real GDP and per capita GDP over time. There are some caveats, though, to think about. These, for example, these numbers, real GDP per capita, therefore, don't take into account changes in let's say, environmental quality or life impacts over time. For example, as leisure time has also increased, perhaps economic well-being is understated. So if the average worker has more leisure time now than they would have done back in 1950s, 1960s, then that's a positive value too to an individual's standard of living. But that's not captured in real GDP. So economic well-being in that case would be understated. Again, looking at real GDP and real GDP per capita over time, broken out by decade, we can see the significant changes in real GDP. These are in billions, and you can see how it's gone from about 2.1 trillion. These are all in 2009 dollars. So 2.1, 2.2 trillion in 1950 to 15.5 trillion in 2012. And how real GDP per capita has gone from roughly $14,300 in 1950 to almost $50,000 in 2012. So, thinking a little bit about this, what is still termed modern economic growth, then how has this changed over time? Well, the big event, the big event that has changed everything was the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution in Britain in the 1700s really was the changing event in terms of looking at how living standards have changed over time. And so prior to the Industrial Revolution, living standards were very stagnant for long periods of time. Years and years would go by and very little change in terms of individual standards of living. But since the Industrial Revolution, again, late 1700s, modern economic growth has been characterized by significant, sustained, and ongoing increase in the standards of living. Standards of living post-Industrial Revolution have increased and sustainably increased over time. People's lifespans have doubled, and ordinary people have been able to experience leisure time and the arts due to this increased wealth and living standards. So we've benefited from the growth in living standards post-Industrial Revolution. So again, thinking about these changes over time, what we would expect to see are these poorer nations really catching up. See this catching up effect. And we expect to see that because the more advanced nations at any particular point in time, what we call the leader countries, are the ones who are inventing new technological processes, the ones who are really driving changes in productivity, which can lead to significant changes in economic growth. And the poorer countries can then just adapt those new technologies. So they're just basically copying the technologies that are developed by the more advanced nations. And by doing that, they can catch up. So they can grow at a faster rate over time and therefore slowly over time catch up to those leader countries. So if we look at one of our measures of economic growth here, real GDP per capita, and we compare it in 1960 and 50 years later in 2010, and we can do this across countries, we can see, for example, we've already tentatively looked at the United States, but how its per capita GDP has gone from almost 15,000 to over 40,000 over that 50-year period. That's a 2.1% growth rate. Well, the United States was already an advanced nation by the 1960s, as was the UK, as was France. And again, these are growing at similar rates, 2.2 and 2.4%. But some of the smaller nations at the time, look at their real GDP per capita back in 1960. South Korea, $1,765. Hong Kong, almost 4,000. Singapore, 4,000. Japan again, 5,000. They have grown at higher rates over that 50-year period. This is the catching up effect. And you can see their real GDP per capita has significantly caught up with certainly France and the UK over that period of time. And when you look at Singapore, it's even surpassed everybody, surpassed even the United States with a 4.6% annual growth rate over that 50-year period. So we can see a similar story. We look at this graphically, looking at real GDP per capita, everything here in US dollars, everything put into 1990 US dollars, and it shows how GDP per capita has changed from the early part of the 19th century to late 20th century. And we can see really before modern economic growth, even though this is post-industrial revolution, it's still the early years after the Industrial Revolution. And you can see, again, early 1800s, standards of living were very similar across the world. But as we move forward in time and nations experienced modern economic growth at different times, and therefore at different rates, we can see principally the red line here, the United States' GDP per capita rising quicker than other parts of the world. And so Japan has followed a similar trend, although below that of the United States, as has Western Europe. You can see the bottom here, Africa has really stayed, their standards of living have stayed quite consistent over that 200-year period. So economic growth is very important to us. We need to track it, and we use it as part of a policy goal. Again, we want to see that 2 to 3% increase in economic growth year on year. So what determines economic growth? Well, there are supply side factors and there are demand side factors. So first of all, thinking about the supply side. Well, this relates to really the ability of the economy to expand. So how capable is the economy to grow on the supply side? Well, that depends on changes, really the increases in the quantity and quality of natural resources, so the natural endowment of the resources that the economy has and how they can increase over time. Increases in the quality and the quantity of human resources. So here we can think of human capital, which is education. Again, better education will allow an economy to benefit, see increases in productivity. Also increases in the supply or the stock of capital goods are important. So machinery and equipment, more machinery and equipment will help the economy increase its productivity and expand. And then also related there, improvements in technology. These changes in technology are very important in terms of driving productivity. So these are all supply side factors that relate to just the general physical ability of a nation to expand, to grow over time. The next determinant is really the demand side. So what we're calling here the fifth determinant. There were 4 supply side determinants. So the fifth determinant of economic growth is a demand factor. And here we're thinking about, well, what we've talked about, households, businesses, and the governments, and their ability to purchase the economy's expanding output. As the economy produces more, well, what about the ability to purchase those extra goods and services? Well, that's on the demand side. So we need to see that too, an increase in ability to spend money on these goods and services. And finally, the sixth determinant of economic growth is the efficiency factor. And so what this means is, in order to reach an economy's full production potential, it really must achieve economic efficiency. And so what that means is that the economy must use its resources in a least costly manner. That's productive efficiency, to produce resources in the least costly manner in order to produce the specific mix of goods and services that maximize people's well-being. So we can really put the 6 factors affecting the rate of economic growth into perspective by, again, looking at a production possibilities frontier. And this is from earlier, when we had our sort of micro recap, when we looked at PPF's production possibility frontiers, but just to sort of show this again and how I can illustrate the concept of economic growth. So here we have our PPF showing different production possibilities between capital goods and consumer goods. And again, here's our PPF here, negatively sloped, reflecting increasing opportunity costs, and any point along the production possibility frontier represents a point of efficiency, like point A. So point A represents producing a certain combination of capital and consumer goods, whatever these two values are that we would read off the relevant axes. And so what would economic growth mean? Well, economic growth just means we're pushing out the PPF, that we're able to move to a point farther out than previously was possible. So what economic growth does is moves out the PPF over time. And now we can produce and consume at, say, point B. Again, point B would now be efficient because it's on the new PPF. And that represents, compared to A, more capital goods being produced and consumed and more consumer goods being produced and consumed. So the economy is growing. So the PPF helps us illustrate this concept of economic growth. The next point is to say that although the demand and efficiency factors that we discussed are important, really most discussions of economic growth look on the supply side, look on those factors that we discuss on the supply side that can foster economic growth. So society can increase its real output and therefore income in two main ways. One is by increasing its inputs or resources. So we can think about a production function. Think of a machine. More inputs going in, there's more output coming out the other side. So we can increase output by just increasing inputs of resources, but also by raising the productivity of those inputs. So how productive the inputs are can also foster economic growth. So to try and simplify this a little bit, if we just consider one input, of course there are many inputs into a production process. There's labor, raw materials, capital is important, land. But we'll look at just labor, just the number of workers, just to try and keep it more simple. Therefore, if we look at labor, then one way of thinking about real GDP is real GDP in any specific time period will depend on the amount of that input, in this case, the number of hours worked. So how many hours do we have available to work? How many people do we have working 40 hours a week? Therefore, in total, how many hours are being worked each year? It's not just about how many hours are worked, it's how productive we are in terms of our labor force too. So real GDP, you can see calculated as the hours of work multiplied by this measure of labor productivity. How productive is that input of labor? So thinking of it this way, a nation's economic growth from one year to the next year depends on these two things. The increase in the labor inputs, that's an increase in the number of people working, and the increase in labor productivity, of course, if any. So if we're going to see any increase in economic growth, we need to see an increase in one or not both of those factors. So again, here really focusing on the input of labor and how productive it is. The schematic can show us a way of thinking of real GDP here, where again up top we have the number of inputs, so labor inputs, hours of work, and that's a function of the size of the employed labor force. How many workers do we have working in the labor force right now? And the average hours of work. So on average, are they working 30 hours a week, 40 hours a week, 50 hours a week? Well, combined, that's telling us or giving us a measure of the labor inputs, the number of hours of work. But then we have to take that and multiply it by our measure of labor productivity, or average output per hour. How productive are our workers? Well, that in turn is a function of different components. How technologically advanced the economy is, the quantity of capital, so how many machines do we have at our disposal? Workers can produce more, can be more productive with more machinery at their disposal. Education and training, how educated is the workforce, is a component into their productivity. More better educated workers should be more productive. The allocative efficiency, so how efficiently are we allocating our resources? And there are other factors too, but these again are the sort of four main ones that really drive this idea of labor productivity. So again, this schematic just shows us that thinking about real GDP, and therefore economic growth, we look at our labor inputs and how productive those inputs are. That's a way of understanding real GDP. So let's think of an example. Let's think of a hypothetical economy. I'm going to call it Siam, and has only 10 workers in our first year of data. So we have 10 workers in Siam in year 1, and each worker works 2,000 hours a year. So that's, we'll assume 50 working weeks at 40 hours per week. So that's the 2,000 hours. Therefore, the total input of labor, so how many workers we have multiplied by how hard they work, how many hours they work. 10 workers working 2,000 hours a year gives us 20,000 hours of our labor input in year 1. Let's say productivity in year 1 was $10 an hour. So that's the average real output per hour of work. So the average of our 10 workers produces $10 worth of real GDP in an hour. Well, if we have 20,000 labor hours worked at $10 an hour, that gives us a real GDP in Siam in year 1 of $200,000. Let's go forward to year 2. And in year 2, our work hours increase to 20,200. We also, though, get a boost in labor productivity. The average worker can now produce $10.40 worth of real GDP in an hour. So not only are we working more hours, we're more productive in those hours too. So again, taking the 20,200 labor hours available, multiplied by the productivity of $10.40 an hour, in year 2, Siam's real GDP will rise to over $210,000. So in terms of its economic growth rate, well, real GDP has gone from $200,000 in year 1 to $210,080 in year 2. So if we plug the numbers into a percent change, take the change in real GDP divided by the original, again times 100, we're looking at a growth rate for Siam of about 5% over that year. On the next slide, I'll show you a table. And the table shows that both increases in the quantity of labor and increases in the labor productivity, as we just saw in our hypothetical example there for Siam, have been very important sources of economic growth in the United States. So when we look at the United States economic growth over time, we've seen both an increase in the quantity of labor, but also an effect the quality, how productive labor has been. So between 1953 and 2012, the labor force more than doubled. In fact, about 2.5 times increase, from 63 million to 155 million workers. The productivity growth, though, has usually been the more of the two significant factors. So here's the table, and what the table does is really break down economic growth in the US over about a 60-year period. And we can see it starts back in the early 1950s and shows between 1953 and 1973, so about a 20-year period, they had about a 3.6% annual increase in real GDP over those 20 years. Over the next 18 years or so, that fell slightly to 2.8%. And you see here in the late 1990s, you had a pretty good time of things in the US economy, increase in real GDP of about 3.8%, but that has fallen since, again, included in this figure are the Great Recession, 2007 to 2009. But what this table also does is breaks down the two contributing factors to the increase in real GDP. Again, the increase in the quantity of labor and the increase in labor productivity. And again, you can see it's the increase in labor productivity that's the more significant of the two factors. So, for example, if we go to the late 1990s data, so 95 to 2001, again, this 3.8% increase in real GDP. Again, most of that was caused by increases in labor productivity. Again, the 1990s, the mid-1990s, the time where there was some significant technological growth, technological advancement, internet became widely available, boosts in telecommunications technology really helped improve real GDP growth. And again, so of the two factors, it's the increase in labor productivity that's the most significant when we're accounting for economic growth in the United States. So when we're looking at economic growth and we're suggesting the importance of measuring economic growth, and within that framework, we're suggesting productivity growth is the important contributor towards economic growth, then I suppose the next logical question is to ask, well, therefore, if productivity growth is so important in accounting for economic growth, then what affects productivity growth? And there are 5 main factors, it seems, that have an influence on productivity growth, of which technological advancement is the largest contributor to productivity growth. It is thought generally that technological advancement accounts for about 40% of productivity growth. And as suggested by an economist, Paul Romer, he stated that human history teaches us that economic growth springs from better recipes, not just from more cooking. So technological advancement is very important. So generally, technological advancement is generated by the discovery of new knowledge. And so this new knowledge allows us to use resources in better ways and therefore improve our economic output. Another important contributor is the quantity of capital. This explains about 30% of productivity growth. So more and better plant and equipment make workers more productive, basically. So a nation acquires more capital by saving some of its income and using that savings to invest in new plant and equipment, and that helps make workers more productive. So the third main contributing factor is education and training. So we're thinking here about human capital. Human capital references education and training. So how educated and how skilled are our workers? So investment in human capital, in education and training, is an important means to increase the productivity of labor. So to look at some stats, by 2012, almost 90% of the US population had at least a high school education, and 31% had a college or post-secondary education. Both of these figures represent a large increase over the past several decades. So in the US, there's a definite trend in a better educated workforce. And again, that's referenced by more people attaining a high school diploma and more people going to college and getting a degree. So here are some data to support that. This shows the percent of the adult population in the US attaining college graduate degree or better, such as a PhD, and also high school graduates or better. And so we can see in the 1960s, less than 10% of the population were achieving a college graduate degree or better, and about 40% were high school graduates or better. Whereas the latest data, 2012, you've got roughly 30%, so 3 times as many people in the population with a college degree or more, and again, almost 90% with a high school degree or better. So large improvements in terms of human capital. Again, this is helping to increase productivity. So it's also interesting to look at human capital across nations, and we look at here two tables showing average test scores of 8th graders in both the disciplines of mathematics and science, taken from 2011. And we can see when we look across nations that the picture isn't so great for the United States. For example, US students perform poorly in terms of science and mathematics test scores relative to students in many other nations, as you can see, ranking 9th and 10th respectively in terms of test scores for mathematics and science. And the United States has been producing fewer engineers and scientists over time. That's a problem that may be traced back to just inadequate training in mathematics and science in the elementary and high schools. So perhaps for these reasons, there's been some recent public policy discussion and legislation directed towards trying to improve the quality of US education and training systems. Another contributor towards productivity growth are economies of scale and resource allocation, which account for about or explain about 15% of productivity growth. In terms of economies of scale are reductions in per unit production costs that come from increases in output levels. So we call these economies of scale. So as markets have increased in size over time, firms have been allowed to increase their output levels and achieve production advantages associated with this greater size, and this advantages in terms of a reduced per unit production costs. Also, improved resource allocation means that workers over time have moved from relatively low productivity employment to high productivity employment. And the long-run movement towards more liberalized international trade, as trade has become freer over time through international trade agreements. This has improved the allocation of resources, and so increased labor productivity, expanded real output both in the United States and for other countries too. This chart here shows the growth in labor productivity. This is measured by changes in the index of labor productivity, and we see this ranging from 1973 to 2012, along with we see two separate trend lines, one from the 1973 to 1995 period and 95 to 2012 period, and we can see the two different trend lines suggesting two different growth rates of productivity across our time period here. We see some sort of structural break there in the mid-1990s where the average productivity growth between 1973 and 1995 was about 1.5%, but between 95 and 2012, productivity growth averaged a higher rate of 2.4%. So, what caused that structural break there? What caused that difference in average productivity growth over those two different time periods? Well, many economists believe that the higher productivity growth from 95 to 2012 came from a significant new wave of technological advancement coupled with global competition. So I mentioned that earlier. For example, the United States achieved a significant increase in productivity growth starting from the mid-1990s, and that was really associated with new wave of technological advancement. The internet really came online and serious boosts in telecommunications technology. Again, coupled with an ever dynamic global economy allowed these higher productivity growth rates that we've seen more recently. Also, some economists think there's a good chance that the higher trend rates of productivity growth can continue for many years to come, so we can continue to reap the benefits of higher productivity growth. So if we're seeing these improvements in productivity growth and we're seeing general trend in an increase in economic growth over time, is it both desirable and slash or sustainable? There is a view that suggests it isn't. Some critics of growth say industrialization and growth result in pollution and climate change, ozone depletion, and other environmental problems. And these adverse or negative externalities, that we call them, occur because inputs in the production process get into the environment and form some type of waste. And therefore, the quicker the growth or the more rapid the growth of an economy and the higher our standards of living, the more waste that the environment must absorb or try to absorb. So further growth will just exacerbate this problem. However, in defense of economic growth, as we've mentioned, this is our measure really of the standard of living. So improved economic growth over time results in improved standards of living over time. And some opponents of the anti-growth view would then suggest that as standards of living increase over time and the economies improve, that human imagination, better human capital, can solve these environmental and resource issues. They are real issues, but as we move forward, we can put our minds to it and try to attack these problems, the negative externalities associated with economic growth. And further, as growth is this path to greater material abundance, resulting in these higher standards of living, which results in increased leisure time, which we value as individuals. It also allows for this expansion and application of human knowledge. So there are many of these positive effects associated with economic growth. Again, thinking of this from a global perspective, there is the Global Competitiveness Index. This is published annually, and it measures the potential for economic growth across countries. And the index that is calculated is based on various factors such as innovativeness, the capacity to transfer technology among sectors, the efficiencies of domestic financial systems, rates of investment, and other factors too. And it's a rank index of these different factors and overall measures a country's ability to achieve economic growth over time. So here we have the top 10 list of countries in terms of global competitiveness in 2012 to 2013. And you can see the United States ranks fairly highly across the world, ranking at number 7, but Switzerland is like the highest ranked of all the nations in terms of global competitiveness.